They walked through forests no longer standing. They hunted along rivers that have long since changed course. But what they left behind, deep in their bones, is still speaking to us. Because in Cambodia's indigenous DNA lies one of the oldest surviving chapters of human history. Older than Angkor, older than Funan, older even than language itself. Far from the spotlight of ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, the aboriginal populations of Cambodia, the Kui, the Phnom, the Breo, carry a gift few others possess, a living archive of the first humans to ever set foot in Southeast Asia. And when scientists sequenced the mitochondrial DNA of over 1,000 individuals across Cambodia, what they found was astonishing. 8 brand new mitochondrial haplogroups, never seen before. Entire branches of the human family tree that had somehow survived here, and only here. Each of these haplogroups, like M59, M69, M78, and N7, are what geneticists call basal lineages. That means they're sitting near the trunk of our collective ancestry, lineages that haven't been touched, diluted, or overridden by later migrations. And their age? Some go back 55,000 to 68,000 years. That's older than any kingdom, older than agriculture, older than the last ice age. But how did these ancient genetic codes survive here, when waves of Bronze Age and Neolithic migrants changed the face of every other part of Asia? The answer lies in Cambodia's rugged northeastern highlands, where dense forests, isolation, and oral traditions preserved both people and their genomes. While neighboring regions were shaped by Chinese expansions, Indian empires, and Austronesian seafarers, these communities held their ground. Their genes are a time capsule, untouched by empires, speaking to us across 2,500 generations. Even more remarkable, these ancient lineages didn't just stay put, they spread. Scientists tracing haplogroups like B5A, F1A, and M12B found they radiated outward from Cambodia to Vietnam, Thailand, southern China, even into island Southeast Asia. These weren't just isolated populations, they were originators, the mothers of civilizations, a genetic epicenter. And unlike other parts of Asia, where lineages get younger the further you look back, in Cambodia, they get older. One lineage found in modern Cambodians, haplogroup M68, traces back over 80,000 years. That puts it right into the window of the first human migration out of Africa. Not just part of history, but part of the beginning. This makes Cambodia one of the few places on Earth where you can find both the memory and the molecular evidence of how humans spread across continents. And yet, until recently, these stories lay buried, not under stone temples or royal inscriptions, but inside the very people walking today's streets. So, the next time you pass through Cambodia's hills or forests, know this. You're walking atop genomes older than kings, older than borders, older than memory itself. When scientists mapped Cambodia's DNA, they expected the obvious: Southeast Asian threads tightly woven together. Khmer with Thai, Khmer with Vietnamese, Khmer with Southern Chinese. A predictable network of regional neighbors. But what they discovered shattered expectations. Because when Cambodia's genetic markers were compared across Asia, something strange happened. The Khmer didn't cluster with the Thai. They didn't match with the Vietnamese. Not even the closest mountains of Yunnan showed a deep alignment. Instead, their genetic trail curved sharply westward. Deep links emerged with populations thousands of kilometers away, with Dravidian groups from India, with isolated Andamanese islanders, even with the Aboriginals of northern Australia. Populations that, on the surface, share no language, no religion, no temples, no art. And yet, in their DNA, they share ancestry. How could this be? Somewhere in deep time, before the sea swallowed land bridges and borders drew invisible lines, these groups shared a single story. A migration that began in Africa and curled along the Indian Ocean rim. A coastal wave of humanity pushing eastward, long before the rise of Asia's great kingdoms. That ancient journey carved a genetic path that still lives in Cambodia today. But this isn't just about the past. The real paradox emerges when we look at modern identities. Cambodia speaks Austroasiatic languages. Its cultural core, from Angkor to Phnom Penh, is rooted in Southeast Asian history. And yet, the DNA resists full assimilation into that narrative. Principal component analyses, the genetic equivalent of family trees, consistently pull Cambodians away from their supposed neighbors. Instead, they drift toward ancient clusters, people with darker skin, isolated islands, languages long extinct. Every statistical model confirms the same anomaly, a hidden current, flowing beneath the surface of modern Southeast Asia. Even among Austroasiatic speakers, Cambodians don't fully align with Vietnamese or Mon groups. Instead, they lean closer to India's tribal populations, like the Birhor and Karya. These aren't political connections. They aren't about trade or religion. This is blood talking, and it tells us something radical, that Cambodia may not just be part of Southeast Asia's genetic story. It may be a remnant of something far older, a genetic relic of the first humans who hugged the coastline, long before anyone built cities, carved Sanskrit, or raised stone towers to gods. A paradox that forces us to reframe Cambodia not as a bridge between India and China, but as a root, an origin point, a place where old worlds collided and became one. The forests may have changed. The empires may have risen and fallen. But inside the bones of Cambodia's people, the truth stayed intact, waiting for science to catch up. It began with a small skeleton buried beneath centuries of silence. A child no older than 7, laid to rest on the banks of the Mekong Delta nearly 2,000 years ago. His bones were found at Wat Kamnu, part of the ancient city of Angkor Borei, a place once whispered to be the heart of Funan, Southeast Asia's first recorded kingdom. But no one expected that this child would carry inside him the answer to a mystery that had haunted historians for decades. For years, scholars debated how deeply India had influenced early Cambodian civilization. The temples, the scripts, the religion, all bore Indian fingerprints. But the question remained, was it mere imitation, or intermingling? When scientists sequenced the genome of this young boy, labeled ABM40, they found something no one predicted. Nearly half of his ancestry traced not to East Asia, but to southern India. And not just any part of India. The signals were specific, rooted in populations like the Irula, Mala, and Vellore, communities far from the imperial centers of the north. This wasn't shallow influence. This was deep biological integration. This child wasn't a merchant's son or the offspring of a casual visitor. His DNA told a story of direct lineage, of a parent or grandparent who had crossed the Indian Ocean and built a life here, not just a trade route. And this child lived around the 1st to 3rd century CE, nearly 1,000 years before most genetic models believed Indian admixture reached the region. That single genome flipped the timeline. Previous studies had suggested that Indian DNA entered Cambodia during the Angkor era, maybe around the 12th or 13th century. But this child proved otherwise. He predated Angkor. He lived during Funan, and his existence means that Indian influence in the region wasn't just cultural or commercial. It was genetic, personal, and early. Geneticists used a method called QPDM to model his ancestry. Out of all potential sources, only southern Indian populations fit. Not North Indian, not Persian, not Central Asian. Southern India. The result was clear and repeated. Across all plausible models, his South Asian ancestry hovered between 42 to 49%. That number changed everything. And it wasn't just the numbers. The structure of his genome included components that aligned with European and Andamanese lineages, signatures typically found within South Asian profiles. It was as if his DNA was a bridge, linking 3 distant worlds in one fragile skeleton. Until his discovery, ancient DNA from Southeast Asia had failed to show any evidence of Indian ancestry. Tropical climates had destroyed most ancient remains, and what little was recovered lacked preservation. ABM40 was the exception. He was the anomaly, and he became the new anchor point for an entire chapter of Cambodian history. This child, without a name, without a monument, may have been the living proof of a dynastic union, perhaps even a descendant of the legendary Brahmin Kondinya and the local Queen Soma, whose union was said to have founded Funan. His genome doesn't just confirm ancient contact. It reframes that contact as the beginning of something far more permanent. His story forces us to reconsider what it means to trace history, that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't carved in stone, but written in the code of life itself. In the shadow of Cambodia's early history stands a tale so fantastical Many believed it to be pure myth. Chinese records spoke of a foreign Brahmin who crossed the ocean in a dream, guided by omens and destiny. His name was Condinya. Upon arrival, he encountered a fierce local queen, Soma, who met his ship with weapons drawn. But legend says he won her heart, married her, and together they birthed a kingdom, Funan. For generations, this story lingered in the fog between folklore and fact. No inscriptions, no royal seals, just a handful of ancient texts and whispers passed down through centuries. Until now, because somewhere in the Mekong Delta, buried beneath the earth, science uncovered a voice that had been silent for 2 millennia. It wasn't a stone tablet. It wasn't a golden crown. It was a child whose DNA told the very story that legends had tried to preserve. The boy from Vat Kamnu, the one whose ancestry held a deep signature from southern India, suddenly took on new meaning. He wasn't just a statistical anomaly. He was proof, biological evidence that the connection between South Asia and Cambodia wasn't a fable. It was real. It had a face. It had blood. The proportion of his South Asian ancestry, nearly half, suggested something far more intimate than trade. This wasn't the legacy of ships passing through coastal ports. This was family, a union, possibly royal. And when geneticists narrowed down his ancestry, they found it aligned not with generic Indian populations, but specifically with southern Dravidian groups. These are the very same regions where ancient sea routes connected to Southeast Asia, trade winds that carried more than goods. They carried people, priests, ideas, and perhaps even founders of dynasties. Funan's early cities, like Angkor Borei, were not tribal villages. They were urban, planned, and spiritual. Brick temples, water reservoirs, symbolic burial rites, all appeared during the time this child lived. And these weren't vague parallels. The iconography, burial materials, even the mortuary layouts mirrored South Indian traditions with uncanny precision. For decades, archaeologists wondered, was this cultural borrowing or colonization? The genome answered, it wasn't either. It was integration, deep, personal, biological, a blending that defied categories. And this genetic revelation did more than validate a legend. It reframed the origin of Cambodian statehood itself. The birth of Funan may not have been a slow, internal evolution. It may have begun with a single, extraordinary relationship between an Indian seer and a Khmer queen, between Soma and Condinya, between worlds. If so, then the foundations of Cambodia's first kingdom weren't just laid in stone, they were woven in flesh. It's a rare moment when science looks into the eyes of mythology and says, you were right. They left no thrones, no empires, no epics carved into temple walls. And yet, their legacy endures in every breath of Cambodia, not in the names of kings, but in the quiet line of mothers who passed down the oldest stories without ever speaking them. While political power in ancient Cambodia rose and fell with dynasties, the real continuity flowed through the women, through the unbroken transmission of mitochondrial DNA, inherited from mother to child for thousands upon thousands of years. And when scientists decoded this maternal legacy, what emerged wasn't just diversity, it was depth. In a sweeping study of over 1,000 individuals from across Cambodia's highlands and valleys, researchers discovered something unprecedented: 8 mitochondrial lineages that were completely unknown to science. Not just rare, new. Entire branches of the human maternal tree that had never been mapped, never been sequenced, and yet had been quietly passed on for over 60,000 years. These weren't imported lineages. They weren't the remnants of traders, migrants, or invaders. They were native, ancient, and enduring. Each one, from M78 to N7, represented a direct genetic thread stretching back to the very earliest settlers of Southeast Asia. Settlers who had walked across the land when it was still wild and unshaped, when the rivers ran unclaimed and the forests held no names. One of these maternal lineages, M68, coalesces to a time nearly 82,000 years ago, making it among the oldest human genetic signatures ever recorded in the region. And that's not just impressive, that's revolutionary, because it proves that modern-day Cambodian populations, especially indigenous communities like the Breo, Staying, and Kui, didn't just arrive later. They are the descendants of the very first humans who crossed into this part of the world after leaving Africa. The fingerprints of these lineages are so deeply rooted that even after thousands of years of cultural upheaval, wars, and migrations, they still exist today. Not in ruins or relics, but in living people. In mothers holding their children in rural villages. In market vendors speaking ancient dialects. In elders whose laughter carries centuries of memory. And these maternal branches don't just tell us who Cambodians are. They show us what Cambodia gave to the world. Because haplogroups like B5A and F1A didn't stay confined. They radiated outward, northward into China, eastward into island Southeast Asia. Cambodia wasn't just a recipient of migration. It was a dispersal point, a silent source. It's easy to look at kings and monuments and call them the architects of history. But sometimes, the true architects are the ones who never held a sword. The ones who carried the next generation not on thrones, but in their arms. The story of Cambodian DNA is not just the story of empires and contact. It's the story of maternal endurance, of women who outlived kingdoms, who passed forward something more enduring than stone, life itself. Long before maps were drawn, before borders were fixed, and before kingdoms etched their glory in stone. A vast, invisible network already connected two ancient worlds, India and Southeast Asia. But it wasn't the kind of highway we imagine. There were no roads, no bridges, only tides. This was the Indian Ocean, a living corridor that carried traders, storytellers, priests, and pioneers across thousands of kilometers of unpredictable waters. And the evidence of this maritime superhighway doesn't just sit in museum cases. It runs through the very veins of Cambodia, in the buried ruins of sites like Oceo and Angkor Borei. Archaeologists unearthed objects that had no local origin. Glass beads made with Roman techniques, spices from the Deccan Plateau, stone amulets carved in unmistakably Indian forms. These weren't isolated finds. They were the leftovers of a thriving network, pulsing with life centuries before most European powers had even learned to sail open seas. But trade explains only part of the story. What genetic evidence revealed later went far beyond merchandise. It showed movement not just of goods, but of genes, of people. The genome of the child from Vat Kamnu, whose ancestry traced nearly half to southern India, was not a statistical glitch. It was a biological record of a human being who was born of two worlds. And he wasn't alone. Although few ancient DNA samples have survived Cambodia's harsh tropical climate, the broader genetic patterns, both in ancient individuals and in living populations, reveal unmistakable markers of South Asian ancestry, but not evenly spread. These genetic footprints are denser in regions known to be ancient ports, near river mouths and coastal settlements, the same places where foreign ships would have anchored, where marketplaces buzzed with unfamiliar tongues, and where new relationships were born, both political and personal. Maritime Southeast Asia wasn't passively receiving visitors. It was actively participating, sending its own people westward, absorbing not just languages but lifeways. Cultural fusion was happening not in royal courts, but in fishing villages and merchant alleys, in temples lit by oil lamps and conversations exchanged in broken tongues. Cambodia became a cultural frontier, not a defensive wall, but a shoreline that invited the world in. And that shoreline became a stage for transformation. Over time, this exchange reshaped religion. Indian cosmology, epics, and ritual systems became deeply woven into Khmer belief systems, not by force, but by fascination. Stone temples began to rise with Shiva carved into lintels, Vishnu reclining in cosmic oceans, not as foreign gods, but as locally embraced visions of the divine. Even agricultural practices, irrigation techniques, and architectural principles show parallels with South India. These aren't coincidences. They are imprints, subtle, powerful, enduring. What the Indian Ocean created was more than a route. It was a living artery, pulsing with the breath of two civilizations learning from each other, mixing blood and belief. And while empires in the north were waging wars over land, this southern corridor quietly shaped the destiny of half a continent. That ocean may seem still today, but its waves once carried the seeds of Cambodia's transformation, not through conquest, but connection. What happens to ancestry when time forgets its name? What remains of a legacy when kingdoms collapse and empires turn to dust? The story of ancient Indian ancestry in Cambodia doesn't end with its arrival. In fact, the most haunting chapter begins after the Golden Age fades. Because while the early Funan child revealed a powerful South Indian imprint, something curious happened in the centuries that followed. That imprint began to fade. Modern genetic studies show a stark contrast. The living Khmer population today carries only around 12 to 15% South Asian ancestry. That's a dramatic decline from the nearly 50% found in their ancient predecessor. So the question echoes louder than ever: what happened in between? History rarely preserves silence. It fills it with myths or forgets it altogether. But the genome speaks differently. It tells us of diffusion, not through conquest, but through dilution. Over generations, waves of local interactions, new migrations, and intermarriages reshaped the population. The original blend, once vivid and bold, became part of a larger mosaic. One major influence: the Austronesian-speaking groups like the Cham, who not only shared land but shaped the cultural and genetic fabric of the Khmer heartland. These weren't just neighbors. They were partners in trade, faith, and, eventually, bloodlines. Genetic data reveals subtle but consistent signals of admixture with groups related to the Atayal of Taiwan, pointing to centuries of maritime and inland integration. But this wasn't erosion. It was evolution. Kingdoms like Chenla and, later, Angkor rose not by preserving purity, but by absorbing difference. The spiritual landscape changed. Temples multiplied. Writing systems matured. Art transformed. The cultural identity became increasingly Khmer, and with it, the gene pool adapted. By the time the Angkorian Empire reached its zenith, Indian influence still lingered in stone, in the curves of Apsara dancers, in Sanskrit inscriptions, in cosmic alignments of temple towers. But the DNA had already begun its journey into something uniquely local, something that wasn't Indian or Chinese or Austronesian, but Khmer. And that transformation wasn't a loss. It was a metamorphosis, a recalibration of identity forged through centuries of encounters, both gentle and violent. Even the child from Vat Kamnu, for all his genetic uniqueness, didn't pass on his lineage into history alone. He was part of a wave that didn't conquer, but blended. And eventually, as newer waves arrived, that genetic signal softened, integrated, and scattered like pollen in monsoon winds. Today, Cambodia's ancestry isn't a clean line. It's a braid, threaded with early migrants, indigenous survivors, and maritime traders. The decline of Indian ancestry is not the story of disappearance. It's the story of transformation, from dynasty to diversity. Because the greatest civilizations don't vanish. They echo in unexpected places, in the rhythm of language, in the lines of a cheekbone, in the faint signature of a gene buried deep in the code of life. One skeleton, one genome, one buried child, and an entire history unraveled. But here's the truth most won't tell you. We've only scratched the surface. ABM 40, the child from Vat Kamnu, gave us a glimpse, not the whole panorama. His 2,000-year-old remains opened a hidden doorway between ancient South India and early Cambodian civilization. But that doorway wasn't a dead end. It was a corridor, and it's still unfolding. Because if one individual carried nearly half South Indian ancestry during the rise of Funan, then who else did? Where are the rest of the bodies? Where are the other children of that maritime mingling? The real challenge is this: Cambodia's tropical climate is the enemy of time. DNA degrades rapidly in heat, humidity, and acidic soil. Most ancient bones disintegrate before we even reach them. The past is there, waiting, but it's fragile, fragmented, vanishing with every rainfall. And yet, the hints remain. Isotopic analysis of ancient teeth suggests patterns of movement, mobility that doesn't align with purely local origins. Subtle dental traits like Carabelli's cusp, rare in Southeast Asia but common in South Asia, show up in unexpected burials. These aren't coincidences. They're shadows of stories not yet told. We now know that Cambodia's population history includes a gene flow event far earlier than any model had predicted. But was ABM 40 a rare exception? A royal child? Or was he just the first in a long line of individuals lost to time? Until we recover more ancient samples, the answer remains just out of reach. But even now, present-day Cambodians hold pieces of the puzzle. They carry low yet consistent levels of South Asian ancestry, especially in regions historically tied to ancient ports and trade routes. Their genomes carry whispers, not of conquest, but of slow, sustained blending. Meanwhile, the kin in Vietnam, thought to be genetically distinct, show unexpected closeness to the Vat Kamnu child in certain datasets. But not all. Some results contradict others. Why? Because ancient history isn't a straight road. It's a tangled forest of migrations, alliances, disappearances, and rebirths. There are inscriptions in Old Khmer that still haven't been fully deciphered. There are burial mounds that have never been touched. There are names lost in wind-worn stone, their voices waiting for the right question to awaken them. And so, the mystery lives on. The child told us something extraordinary, but he also left behind a question, one that echoes louder with every new discovery. What else are we missing? What kings have no tombs? What queens were never named? What migrations went unrecorded because they happened not through armies, but through love, trade, and the quiet choices of ordinary people? History often favors the loud, the conquerors, the builders, the chroniclers. But genetics listens to everyone. Every drop of ancestry is a vote cast by the past. And Cambodia's DNA is still casting ballots we haven't yet counted. This isn't the end of the story. It's the invitation to the next chapter. And it's one we must read, not in books or museums, but in the buried silence beneath our feet, and in the codes written into who we are.